So in some ways, these are the hardest kind of things to do, is when you actually talk to your colleagues that you're likely to see the next day. Usually when you present, 99% of the people you may never ever see again. So you can make mistakes and feel just fine about it. So I would like to mention Sylvia Scribner. The award that I presented at ARA is for Division C, which is the Learning and Instruction Division. And Sylvia Scribner is well known because of this book, Mind and Social Practices. And there's just a little bit of blurb here. I'm not going to read through it. But she was particularly good at connecting education and culture together. And for her work, early work in this area, this award was named. And we've been really successful at ASU in terms of this award. David Berliner has received this award. Mickey Chi has received this award. It's possible Gene Glass has as well, and I just didn't look far enough back. And my wife, Karen Harris, received it as well a couple of years ago. In terms of thinking about this, what you do in these kind of things is you say a little bit about your journey along the way. So I'm going to say that. But I'm also going to talk about some of the things about writing in particular that we've kind of learned along the way. I do want to point out, you see all these mini-me's, so to speak. I'm not going to use the word I very much today. I will a little bit in just a second. But if you hear me do it again, David, you can say gotcha. When I was a young man, I lived on the Georgia-Florida line, and James Brown used to be, in a minute. I should have known better. James Brown used to play there, and I would hear him, and he was phenomenal. But every now and then in a song, he'd say, gotcha. And I used to think that was part of the song, and I saw a special. That was when a musician missed a beat, and they were fined $50 was the gotcha. So when I say go, if you hear me say I again, you can say gotcha. But you can't talk about your work over a 40-year period or a 10-year period without recognizing it's not you, it's a whole lot of people. So it's a lot of people in this case that I've worked with, and it's a lot of people across the globe. Right now, the only place that I don't have a working relationship is in Africa and Antarctica, and I'll be in Antarctica as soon as penguins learn to write or want to write. And then we've used a lot of different tools. Now, what you'll typically think of me is, quantitative tools, because that's pretty much what I'm known for. But I have been involved in some studies where we looked at stuff qualitatively. But I'm pointing this out for a reason. And also all of this for a reason, is that the work that we do is not singular anymore. It's interdisciplinary and interperson. And so you can't do this work anymore unless you work with people that have skills that complement yours. And so it really is a group effort. So for me, my journey starts as a teacher in 1974. On the south side of the tracks in Valdosta, Georgia. I was a special education teacher working in an elementary school. In many ways, though, it started before this point. When I was in first to fourth grade, I was every teacher's terror. My report cards always said, can't sit still, can't keep his hands off of others, and can't be quiet. And so my grades reflected that as well. And so I hated school. I literally hated it. And I had a teacher in fifth grade that was phenomenal, changed my life in terms of thinking about school. And so when I started thinking about what I wanted to do, I was 23, 24 at this point, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought about that teacher. And so I said, that's what I want to be. I want to be a teacher who works with kids who have difficulty learning. So that's kind of my starting point, and that'll be the last I or me, hopefully, unless David catches me. My journey also soon included a companion Voyager. Karen's not here today, but the first time I presented this, she didn't know this slide was in here. I think we were probably 30, so this was probably about 6 years later at this point, and we had just started working together, and obviously, this is a little closer relationship than you have with most of your colleagues. So I'm going to make 4 kind of basic assumptions guiding our work today, and they're not in this slide. But I do want to say a little bit about thinking, how I got from here to back to 40 years ago. You know, quite honestly, for those of you who are newer to the field or just beginning as students, I got to be really frank, I had no idea what I was doing. And I say that if you said to me when I was an assistant professor at 28, would I be doing this now? Not a clue. Not a single clue. You know, I had an idea that I was interested in writing. That probably was it. I had some tools. I had an advisor who was not a researcher, so it took me about 6 years before I'd even call myself a researcher. But in terms of thinking about the journey ahead, what was the driving factor for me was, one, I was really interested in writing, probably because I was a lousy writer and I was learning to write, and that drew my interest into it, and I was intrigued with the Paris reviews where you had people like Hemingway, Toni Morrison, and other people talking about how they wrote. So that kind of just all came together for me at the right point of time. And remember that issue about not being able to sit still back when I was in second grade? That was a great asset as an adult because I had more energy than I knew what to do with. And so over time, what happens is that as you keep that energy going, you keep turning over the same stone in different ways, you actually develop a career that you can look back and say, hey, you know, it's broader than I would have ever thought it was going to be, and it has a chance to make a difference. So I want to point that out. If you aren't exactly sure of what you're doing today, that really isn't the most important thing. I don't think I've met more than 3 people in my whole life when they came out of doctoral school who said, this is what I'm going to do. Most of us kind of work our way into it over time. So the first thing that I'd like to point out, and I got a little too far ahead of myself there and didn't realize it. So I'm going to use these A's, B's, and C's on the basic points, and they have some kind of side points to them. The first thing in terms of thinking about writing, because that's really what I'm going to talk about, that's what our research is focused primarily in, is it's really complex. And I'll come back to this in terms of kids in a minute. So a couple of years ago, I developed a model that I'm particularly proud of. You know, there's certain things that you really like that you've done over your career. This is probably, for me, one of the things I'm most proud of. What it does is it brings together both cognitive and social cultural viewpoints. And so the reason that I'm proud of this is that if you'd have asked me before coming to ASU, you know, would I ever do that? The answer probably would have been no. And so one of the good things about not being in departments where you're siloed with other like-thinking people is that it pushes you to think more broadly. And so maybe about 10, 12 years ago, I started thinking about, you know, it's not just what you bring to something cognitively, but the context really shapes what happens. Now, I'm starting with the cognitive end of this kind of to illustrate the complexity on the cognitive end, but on the next slide, I'll move into the social. But I would probably argue at this point in my career, writing is a social activity. That's kind of obvious. And it's the primary driver in terms of the kinds and types of writing we do and the development that we undertake. In terms of thinking about the cognitive end, just to kind of give a sense of the complexity, and this is really talking about skilled writers here, not necessarily young children at this point. We have a number of hypothesized executive processes that are at the top of this that we use to manage and control what we do in writing. And those include kind of at the bottom of that executive functions where, you know, we do things like set goals or other people set them for us. We decide how we're going to do them. We monitor what we're going to do. We make adjustments and changes, but we have to focus attention, and we do our processing and writing within the context of what we typically think of working memory. So that's pretty well established on those basic points, working memory, attention, and executive functioning in the field of cognition in general. But obviously, we have to draw on something to make this happen. And part of what we draw on is our internal resources, what we know. Not just what we know about content that we're writing about, but what we know about the different processes, schemas that we might have for carrying out a task for writing, what we know about spelling, what we know about vocabulary, our knowledge about reading. There's a whole host of these things that we draw upon. And all of this, in many ways, is driven by our beliefs. And I'm not going to go into all the motivational beliefs that we use to do this, but just think about efficacy as one. If you feel you're confident and you can do something, you're much more likely to engage into it and spend more time and persevere in it as well. In addition to that, for writing specifically, we've got to carry out various processes. And these include things like conceptualizing what we're going to do, bringing up ideas, putting them, transcribing them into sentences, and reconceptualizing, constantly interplaying as we go out this. And these are all modulated or moderated by emotions, our personality traits, and also our physical states. Now, that's what's happening in my head when I write. It's happening, I would argue, pretty much in most people's heads to some degree. In addition, this is all taking place, not back there with the brain, within a context. And so at the center of this, there's various goals at writing communities, and I kind of envision this in terms of different writing communities. And people belong to a number of different communities as they're adults in terms of writing. There are those of us who write. But those communities have particular goals that they're engaged in for writing. Writing serves particular purposes in a community. You're in a classroom. You write for particular purposes. That doesn't mean that you don't bring your own goals into that, but the community has goals which you're trying to accomplish and the community's trying to accomplish. And those goals are achieved through actions and tools, and that produces a written product. Now, that's not going to, for those of you who have a social cultural viewpoint, that's a pretty common, that's action theory, basically, at the core of this. And then around this is we have other people that we interact with, and then around that, in terms of the community, we have all the things that shape communities, which include culture, social, political, historical events, etc. And so my thinking about this in terms of putting this together is that when you bring the two together, there's a couple of things that I think we can say reasonably well, that are, I think, reasonably supported. One is that community or context shapes what you write and shapes your development as writers. But that's also shaped, we're not ciphers. We can make intentional decisions about what we want and what we want to do. So our own goals, our own intentions, our own capabilities shape and determine what we do. And really, writing ends up being an interaction between the two of these. Now, the other tenets on this, I'm just going to briefly mention very shortly, but also when we're talking about working in a community, communities have different capacities. Some communities are brand new. They don't know what they're really doing yet. Like the first night you have class, students don't know you, you don't know the students, they don't know what your expectations for writing are. They're going to learn that. The capacity of that community is developed over time, historically, etc. And some communities are rich in that capacity and some are not. Just like some individuals have more experience, more knowledge, more skills with writing. And so that variability across communities, across individuals, shapes what happens in terms of writing. That variability also exists because communities don't operate in the same way from day to day. They vary a little bit. Same thing with humans. And so that also shapes this interaction as well. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of other kinds of things that are going on, at least in terms of thinking about other communities that shape the individual community you're in. And also for an individual, you're shaped by a whole bunch of things like genetics, your environment in which you're living, etc. So it's a really complex thing. So you're going to be a little surprised at the next slide because I'm going to shift now to kids. This is my spirit guide for kids who are beginning to write or kids who might find writing challenging. It was a dark and stormy night. Do you all know what this line's from? Supposedly the worst novel ever written. And this is why Snoopy picks it up, or Charles Schulz picks it up and uses it a lot of his kids. So remember that complex model of cognition that I presented? What little kids do is they take that complex model and they convert it into something that they can do. They don't have the complex model. They have bits and pieces of what's going to eventually become skilled writing. So what they do is they basically turn writing into content generation. And why? It's actually a very sophisticated strategy when you're a little kid. Everything's difficult. Transcribing words. I mean, you watch a first grader and it's like they're drawing letters a lot of times, or a kindergartner. A lot of conscious attention, a lot of resources going into that. So if you think about the kind of thinking aspects of writing, planning, monitoring, evaluating, revising, goal setting, those also take a lot of cognitive resources. And that bubble's only so big. There's only so much cognitive resources available. You have to get words onto paper. So what kids do is they tend to minimize those other kinds of things, and content generation tends to be the way they approach this. So if I'm asked to write a story about a cow, I kind of know how a story starts. Once upon a time, and I know a little bit about a cow. There was a cow out in the middle of a field. And then that serves as the stimulus for the next item, which serves as the stimulus for the next item, which serves as a stimulus for the next item. And you know what? You get something written. It reasonably hangs together, but it doesn't represent kind of what we were talking about before, which is very planful, very evaluative, and very thoughtful. But that's a way of coping with this. So this is kind of our starting point for a lot of young kids from a cognitive perspective. A second point that I'd like to make, writing is not a single thing. So, Arizona has a test of writing. NAEP has a test of writing. And we assume that writing is a general ability or skill that exists. I can tell you for myself, I'm, at this point in life, a pretty good article writer. God help me if I had to write poetry. Because I like poetry, but I'm not good at writing it. And I would never be able to write a good novel, at least one that anybody would want to read. Okay? So I'm good at some things in writing and not so good at others. And in fact, when we take a look at kids, what we find is that the relationship, how they're writing in terms of our measures of it, whatever we want to use, except for a few small ones, if we take something like quality, you could have some kids who write really great stories, not so good with persuasion. You have some kids who write really good informative texts, not so good with poetry. We did a study a couple of years back, which is listed here. And what we found was that, just like kids in general, even kids who are on the bottom 25th percentile or below, they vary considerably in how well they write. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about writing, we're not talking about a single thing. We're talking about multiple things. And the other point that I'd make here, it's something that develops across the lifespan. For those of us who keep writing, we're never really done. It's not like we reach this point and we're the master. It's never that way. Because every new topic, every new challenge makes this real for us, that we have not fully mastered this. And so as another example of this, and just really briefly, of why these things aren't the same thing, we've done a number of studies where we like to do, on our intervention studies, you want to make sure everybody gets something that's worthwhile. One of the complaints that I often hear from doctoral students in the English department when they take the course I teach is that, they would never do quantitative work. And I ask them why, and they said, because somebody doesn't get something. Well, it could be that way, but it doesn't have to be. And so one of the things that we often do if we're teaching, say, a strategy for writing a persuasive text, an opinion essay, or a strategy for writing a story, this might be our treatment condition, is if you think about that in terms of a true randomized experiment, and that might be our control. It could be vice versa. Everybody gets something, but guess what? When we teach kids how to plan a persuasive text using some of the basic elements of persuasion, or how to write a story using some of those things, we don't get crossover. Just because I teach you to write a persuasive text doesn't necessarily make you a better story writer. And that kind of illustrates the point that I was making before. Genre plays a role in terms of our text. They're not genre-free. They have particular constraints and elements and social boundaries put around them in terms of what they are within particular contexts and how we view them. Another point I'd like to make is that writing is challenging. All of us have probably been where this kid is at some point in time. And I'm going to illustrate this particularly come back to my favorite group of learners, which are kids with special needs. So we've done a series of meta-analysis where we've looked at kids who have, say, who are classified as having or identified as having a learning disability, ADHD, or speech or language problems, or, who are considered to be struggling readers. And you look at them in comparison to kids who don't have those similar problems. For example, in speech and language, no history of language problems that are evident. And so when you compare them, you have these minus signs up there. That means kids with learning disability are full standard deviation in terms of writing quality, lower on judgments of that than their typically developing kids. Now, I'm not going to say much more about this, but the point here is that there's a lot of variability in terms of how well our kids do. Some kids are great writers. They love to write. They enjoy the challenge, and they work hard at it. And we have other kids, I guarantee you out of this group, many of these kids are going to say to you, I do not like to write. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this in working with kids. After about second grade, it's the biggest hurdle that we face in terms of trying to move the needle forward, is that motivational element. Now, with that said, I want to come back to that variability issue that I mentioned. We get surprises all the time when we work with kids. And so one is that you see unexpected performance sometimes. So we'll do these single subject design or single participant design studies where basically you collect baseline data over a series of points on kids' writing with each individual kid. So it's a very close look at every single kid. And you're trying to establish kind of a stable pattern of performance before you start doing something with kids to try to improve it. And we'll have these kids going along right at the bottom of performance, and then all of a sudden there's this huge spike, and it drops back down. And so sometimes you hit a topic that a kid loves, and they show unexpected performance that you didn't think was going to be there. So sometimes what you think a kid can do is not actually what a kid can do under the right circumstances. So that's always a caution in terms of thinking about me putting up that previous slide in terms of what I said. Also, with a little bit of jogging, even the kids who everybody else thinks are the weakest writers are capable of more than we expect. So let me give a couple of examples of this. So with kids with learning disabilities, we had a study where what we basically did is we had them write an opinion on something that we had found from other kids that kids of the same age were interested in writing. So something that we were hoping they'd write a lot about. Now, kids with learning disabilities, remember where I said it's basically like a dark and stormy night, content generation? That's their primary approach, but they don't generate very much. And so we didn't get a lot of text, but as soon as they were done, we said to them, you know what, can you tell me more? And we did this under a number of different conditions. One was a dictation condition, one was a writing condition, and the other one I'm not going to mention because it's too complex to explain, too much time. But what we did is we did that 3 times. What we found was kids generated 3 times as much text, either orally or in written form. So if we'd have taken that first piece, what would our supposition been? Either one, these kids don't have much to say, or they can't say much. The reality is they had a lot more to say than we thought they did. And a very small prompting got them to do quite a bit more. Another thing is, you often think, you ask kids to do a persuasive text, and you get it back and it's an I side or a my side kind of thing where they don't talk about the other side of the argument, okay? And so one of the things when you look at that, your assumption is they don't know how to write an argument. I tend to think of arguments dealing with both sides. But if you give kids the goal up front and you say, I want you to, write about this text, tell us what your opinion is, but deal with both sides, guess what? They can do it. So sometimes, when we ask kids to write, or they do particular, they don't show all they can do, or we don't put it in the right way for them to show. And then as another example, I sometimes think when we look at kids writing, we're looking at kids who have a hobble on them, like a horse does. You'll never say I use this to my wife. My wife has a horse, and I hate horses. That probably doesn't say a lot of good things about me, but we did a study where what we did was it was a revising study. So what do kids typically do almost all the way through high school? You ask them to revise to make their paper better. What they tend to do is they clean up a little bit here, change a word or two, maybe add a little something there, try to deal with spelling and mechanics here, but not much of substance. And so what we did in this case was we basically had them go through and highlight any place that they thought was a problem. And then they had a series of cards to help them diagnose what the problem was. And there was one of the cards was, I don't know, because we often don't know what the problem was. And then they had a series of cards that directed them to make something. This is a cumbersome thing, right? It's not what you'd want to do normally, pick out cards for every one of these. Well, guess what? What we found was not only did the quality of the revisions that they made improve, but the quality of their text improved as well. So it was like they weren't able to execute the processes involved in revising, finding the aha moment where the problem is, diagnosing or not diagnosing the problem, and making an extended change. But as soon as you provided a little bit of scaffolding to do that, you saw capabilities that you did not expect based on their previous performance. So if I say nothing else today, I think this is probably the most important thing I can say, is we too often underestimate what kids can do, and with a little bit of scaffolding, they're often able to do much more than what we expect. The fourth thing here, and believe me, I'm going to come back to the other side of this, writing must be taught. So why am I saying that? The point I really want to make here, I actually believe this, okay? I do think that there are some kids who probably, without a lot of instruction, will become good writers. But often there's instruction taking place outside of school, in the home and other ways. But for the majority of kids that I see in school, it helps if somebody, I'm going to take something really simple. My daughter hates writing. She's a great writer, but she'll never write, hardly ever, unless it's social media, which she doesn't consider writing. When she was in first grade, she formed U's like this. Okay? Every letter was like a drawing. Nobody taught her how, this was partially my fault. Nobody taught her how to write letters of the alphabet. Everything was slow and laborious. In fourth grade, she couldn't spell H-E-R-E correctly. And so a little bit of instruction, she went to a wonderful school, Quaker school. We loved the school. They didn't teach anything directly, okay? This would have been a place with a little bit of instruction. It would have helped. She couldn't read at the end of first grade. I taught her phonics. My wife and I taught her phonics in 6 weeks. That's all she needed. But kids need, for certain kinds of things, I would argue, some kinds of instruction. But the real reason I put this up here is that every kid is capable of learning, even kids who are most vulnerable. Kids with special needs, even kids with severe cognitive challenges, can learn to write better. And we have considerable research, not just we, but the large collective we, that that's the case. So I think that's an important thing to say, is that I think our work and the work of others really demonstrates this strongly. However, I also want to point out, teaching is only a part of the process. We learn by doing, okay? We learn a lot of things incidentally. So let me give an example going back to spelling. So remember, my daughter had spelling difficulties. So what would a typical school do with typical spelling instruction in the past? Every week you'd have a list of words that you would learn. And there might be some instruction on the basic, connections between sounds and letters in various ways between words. So how much can you actually learn from that? Well, it turns out that you only teach about 3,600 words in the best situation, across first to sixth grade. Most of you can spell correctly 10 to 15,000 words. You didn't learn them by direct instruction. You learned them as you wrote, you learned them as you read, you learned many of these skills incidentally. So when we talk about teaching, we really need to talk about, at least that would be our perspective, both of these coming together. And it doesn't mean that one's more important than the other. There's going to be times, obviously, you're learning more through spelling, through reading and writing than you are through direct instruction. That takes the predominance. If you don't read a lot, you're not going to be as good a speller. Now, there are some issues with this. If you're not a good reader to begin with, or not a good speller to begin with, you may not learn as well incidentally. But it still doesn't mean that you abandon that approach. And you'll see this last point here, and I put this on here on purpose. So we did a meta-analysis where we looked at explicit instruction versus implicit instruction. So it happens that, at least with the measures used, explicit instruction in spelling had stronger effects than implicit instruction. So you might say, oh, well, Steve's going to say we need to teach explicitly. No, Steve's going to say we need to do both. Just because one trumped each other in what you got at the end doesn't mean it's going to give you everything that you need. And so this is another point I'd like to make, is you want to look beyond an individual study or review to think more broadly about what's required to be competent in a particular area. Because believe me, I know plenty of people who wouldn't have given the counter here that it's both when they found this. I have a number of colleagues who would have said this means explicit instruction, we don't need to worry about the other kinds of things. But the reality is that's not going to work in the best interest of our kids. The journey to determine how to teach writing effectively, at least for us, is focused on 4 kind of catalysts that move you forward. Now, I want to do a shout out on the first 3 to Patricia Alexander, who's at the University of Maryland. She has a model of domain learning, which initially when Karen and I started, there wasn't much research in writing, and particularly with kids. What we knew as teachers was that a lot of the kids that we were working with were not very strategic in terms of their writing. They used that kind of knowledge-telling approach that we saw Snoopy with before. A lot of them, because they found writing challenging, were not very motivated, and their knowledge was, at least what we could see, seemed to be spotty. And so we thought those were important, and it turns out that we were able to then, we hooked up with Pat's model, and that provided us with a theoretical framework that went beyond our kind of practical experience. I've added to her model here writing skills. So what she would argue is that as you move from being novice to competent, expertise or movement in any one of these areas can move you along the road towards competence. All 3 are necessary to move to expertise, which few people reach. I also added writing skills here. So if you think about transcription, you think again about my daughter, spelling and handwriting fluency, which were really low. That interfered with these other things. It made her less motivated. It made her not want to be strategic. And because she didn't write much because of those things, she acquired less writing knowledge until she was able actually to make the transition to working on a computer. That was the saving grace for her in terms of a writer. But I wanted to mention that. So our journey has tried to focus in on these 4 catalysts, if you'd like, and we've approached it in multiple ways. And so I want to kind of give you the big picture on this. Now, if you'd asked me this 35 years ago, you wouldn't see the little X's up there like you see them now. So what happens is we create our own history as we go along. But in a sense, around the year 2000, this started to be the framework that we use for thinking about this. If we think strategic processing, motivation, and knowledge are important in any domain, we would argue that these things should be true within that domain. 1, more advanced writers, that's our domain here, possess more of that strategic prowess, more knowledge, more motivation than less advanced writers. Individual differences in terms of, say, strategic prowess would predict how well one writes. So, the more planful you are, the assumption would be the better you are as a writer. Now, there's limits on this. When you reach expertise, all bets are off. And does teaching one to be strategic improve students' writing? So a lot of our work is focused in on these three theoretical points and across those four areas: strategies, motivation, knowledge, and skills. And so I'm just going to give a couple of examples of this just to kind of illustrate. So in 1993, we did an interview study, and this will illustrate some of the different techniques we've used with kids. The struggling writers were kids who had been identified as kids with learning disabilities. And we interviewed them about what they knew about writing, and we also interviewed kids who teachers had indicated were good writers. And, at least as far as we could see, had not had trouble with writing in the past. And in one way, I tend to think of this by this cartoon here, which you may or may not have seen before. Calvin and Hobbes are doing a report together at the end of this, and Calvin's sure we got enough information. Hobbes says it's one fact that you made up, but by the time we add an introduction, a few illustrations, look like a graduate thesis. Besides, I've got a secret weapon that works on teachers every time, clear plastic binder. And so you might be thinking, what has that got to do with our interview? So here's what we found, and I'm stretching this to the extreme for a minute, and I'll come back and tell you where it was, what the real thing is here. But I'm going to give you some things that kids who were the better writers and the kids who were kids with learning disabilities said. So when we ask the more skilled writers, what do good writers do? They read it over and see if they have everything they want. They think of very creative ideas. When we ask the kids who are more at risk, they use whatever paper the teacher tells them. They get plenty of sleep. I can hear that the day before you're taking a test for the state. More skilled writers on how do you make your paper better, make the ending real exciting, put my sentences in different order. Those are the kind of things you want to be hearing. And then from the less skilled writers, make sure I have my date and name on there. Write it bigger so that it takes up more space. I love that one. I have to tell you, I said my daughter didn't write. In first grade, I drove around with her, much to my chagrin now, looking for the largest line paper known to man, because she had to write a full page the next day. So, I'm almost embarrassed to say I did that. But I colluded in that process. So I presented the extremes here, okay? So what we basically found was about 66% of the responses by the stronger writers were about process and content. 66% of the responses by the kids who found writing more challenging were about mechanics and product. So, they talked about transcription, they talked about those kinds of things. It's not that the good writers didn't, it's just there was a complete imbalance between the two of them. And we've seen that in interviews that we've done. We've probably done this about 10 or 12 times in studies. It comes up every time, and it hasn't mattered about the kids. And there's even some research with adults who find writing challenging that see that they define writing in terms of product and not in terms of process, which good writers always talk about process and content for the most part. In terms of thinking about that second point, because that was on the first, you're stronger or you're not, and you differ. This one kind of covers a line, but it's a motivation study that we just did not long ago. About 185 middle school students. And basically what we found on a norm reference test, this was on a grant, girls tended to be better writers than boys. This is, as a general thing, is pretty common across the US and across countries. I actually have never seen a study where boys come out as a group stronger than girls. Doesn't mean that some boys aren't better writers, just as a group, in group thing. Now, in this study, we also looked at attitudes towards writing. Now, we also looked at attitudes toward reading. So when I say this, we controlled for attitudes for reading first before looking at attitudes towards writing. What we found on academic writing, girls and boys were about equal in terms of, academic print kind of stuff and recreational print, and, a little less positive about academic stuff than they were about recreational. But when it came to digital, girls were more positive than boys were, both for reading and also for writing. Now, I don't know if this would hold up. We have a second study where we're looking at this. We don't know yet. The point isn't that I know this is a solid fact at this point, and that's another thing I'd like to say right at the start. An individual study means nothing in my world, from my point of view. We have to be able to replicate it, and we have to see this multiple times before I start to feel comfortable with this. I don't know that this will happen again. Until we replicate it, I can't be sure. I'm pretty sure that girls are going to be stronger boys and writers because there's tons of stuff on that. But that's kind of another way we've approached this. And in this same study, we did the correlational stuff, which was that second thing, individual differences relate to. And we found that basically after controlling for reading motivation, writing motivation did account for unique variability in how well kids wrote. And then the final study that I want to share with you here is a little bit more complicated. But remember Pat's model that I mentioned before? Strategies, knowledge, motivation, and skills. Well, we basically, at the beginning of the year and end of the year, we collected lots of measures with kids. And what we did was we put together, and I'm just going to jump forward a little bit. We'll do this first. So this has nothing to do with what I'm going to say, but I like it. Nobody can ever spell this word correctly. Please excuse Pedro from being absent yesterday. He had diarrhea. You know, I challenge you to spell this word correctly. This parent wasn't going to give up, but by God, they were going to get it right. So obviously just a ploy for a cheap laugh, as I move along. You got this really complicated looking picture here. But basically what we did in this study, depending upon which time it was, we got a little bit more sophisticated by the spring than we did in the fall. But we'd have multiple measures for each construct. So like, if we were talking, we first controlled for reading performance. That's where the main idea is. I don't know why it says sex there. It should say gender. But then for motivation, we looked at attitudes to writing and self-efficacy, okay? There's other measures, but those are the ones that we picked. And I could justify why, but it doesn't really matter. For knowledge, we looked at students' topic knowledge about what they were going to write. We looked at signaling words, which is knowledge about, kind of the transitional words. And we looked at unique words, which we saw as a measure of vocabulary, knowledge, or diversity. So that represented our knowledge. And you could quibble whether those are good or not. And then we only had one measure of, kind of skills. That was the spelling errors. And then we had two measures taking a look at strategic. Did they plan? And the sophistication of the plan. And then we have a scale that we've modified from some work in Britain that asks kids to tell us about their approach to writing, how they go about doing it. So maybe a little softer in some ways, but you can't get at everything kids do by just watching them, because a lot goes on in their head. So what did we find here? Basically what we found is we had all these variables entered in at once, and it accounted for like 60-something% of the variance in terms of writing quality. And with human behavior, that's really good, because there's error in these measures. What we found is that when you removed one of these, like you removed the strategic stuff, so you compared the full model to the model without the strategic, they differed. That happened with every single one of these. So each of these constructs accounted for unique variance when you controlled for the variance due to the others. So that's a lot better than that last study where I said, oh, you know what? We found that motivation predicted writing performance when we controlled for one other thing, reading motivation. In this case, our constructs all accounted for unique variance when you controlled for about as much variance as we're going to get in this kind of study. So that's been another way we've kind of approached this. And then finally, that last point is, does teaching X improve students' writing? So this is kind of what I would say is our bailiwick in terms of what we do. If you ask me what kind of researcher you are, Steve, and sometimes I get frowns when I say this, I'm an intervention researcher. We design things, usually based on what we see teachers do, sometimes based on what we think the literature says, sometimes a combination of those things. We test them out, and we test them out, and we test them out. So we usually start with a single participant design where maybe 3 or 4 kids are getting it, but we can watch them really carefully. We can modify what we do on the basis of that study. Then we do a study where we have our students carry out, because that's a pretty controlled condition, because you know the students are going to carry it out correctly. And then we move to professional development and teachers doing it. And so by the time we get to professional development, we can say with teachers, hey, look, this is kind of what we see. We can show papers. We don't have to give numbers. We can actually show kids writing. This is kind of what we find. And we give the range of that because, you know, what typically we do, I hate to say this, what typically happens in a lot of research, we show our best. And that sets us up for failure, and it sets teachers up for failure as well. And so in terms of thinking about this, you know, we've done this with teaching planning, revising, sentence structure, handwriting, spelling, topic knowledge, as some of the examples of areas we focused our attention. We've done studies with process writing. We've done studies using digital writing tools. So we've tried to approach this from a number of different perspectives. And here's what I can say in general. When we take a look at not just our literature and the literature broadly, I think we've done 20 meta-analysis or 21 meta-analysis to date. I'm running out of topics in writing. What we found is that when you teach kids the thinking processes, planning, evaluating, monitoring, revising, large effects in terms of kids writing across different genres. Doesn't mean that if I do persuasive, it generalizes to informative writing, but you get better at that kind of writing. Kids get the tools for doing it. It doesn't mean that's the end point, because if they continue to do the same thing we teach them the rest of their lives, that's a failure situation. They need to grow. We also find that when we, you know, basically when you help kids acquire knowledge about writing through reading, that they then apply in their own writing, they get better. When you teach them vocabulary to use in their writing gets better. These are all effect sizes for writing quality. When we concentrate on enhancing motivation, writing quality gets better. And we teach handwriting, spelling, and typing to kids in grades 1 to 3. The quality of their writing gets better. The handwriting, spelling, and typing get better, but more importantly, the quality of their writing gets better because we've taken that out as an interfering factor. And we teach kids to be more facile in terms of sentence construction. Not only do their sentences and grammar get better, but the quality of their writing gets considerably better. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but there's a lot of other things that we found out that make or help us develop stronger writers in terms of developing writers as kids. I want to point out one on here in particular, two on here in particular. The second one down is from a meta-analysis that just was accepted in Review of Educational Research after what I thought was a 2-year struggle that I wasn't ever sure I was going to get there. But what we did in that meta-analysis is we looked at what happens when you have kids write, and this was from 1st grade to 12th grade, about content in social studies, science, and math. And across the 3 areas, there was about 1/3 of an improvement in their learning of that content material. And so that's no small thing. And the reason I'm saying this is I'll say something in a little bit. Despite all the things that I can say here, I can say to you, we know how to teach writing. We know that writing has a positive effect on learning. What I'm going to say to you in a minute is we don't see much writing or writing instruction going on in schools. I also want to point out another thing, because this is a different kind of tack that we've taken. You see on the bottom here, it says creating a positive and motivating classroom environment makes a difference. We didn't find that out from quantitative studies. That's almost impossible to determine. What we did there is we did a meta-synthesis of qualitative studies with exceptional literacy teachers, and we treated each qualitative study as a case. And so we basically did a qualitative analysis to see what themes came up across teachers. And so this was the interesting thing to us. Well, this came up. These teachers created a safe environment in which kids could take a risk, a positive environment. They tended to be a member of that environment in terms of writing. But almost everything else I've said here, they taught, they supported writers, kids wrote. All the things that I would say to you are primary things in terms of being a good writer from the quantitative end are supported by looking at exceptional teachers. So that's kind of the end point on this that I'd like to point out. It's more than one kind of evidence that counts here. What you really want is you want all of the evidence, if you're lucky, to converge. You feel much stronger about whatever you say when the qualitative, the quantitative converge. Now, they're not going to converge ever completely. The best that you can get is a reasonable amount of convergence, because human behavior, the context in which we work, are very variable. So I don't expect things to be perfect, but generally I feel fairly comfortable putting this list up there for you and sharing that list with teachers or policymakers. And then the other thing I'd like to say is we've also done a number of meta-analysis taking a look at the connection between reading and writing. And so guess what? You teach reading, you read, you teach reading, you get better as a writer. You write, you teach writing, you get better as a reader. You combine the two together, you get better as a reader and writer. That seems to me to be obvious, but we don't see a lot of that going on. And the evidence on quantitative and I think qualitative support that. And then finally, the last point I'd like to make is that in terms of this journey, the initial part of this was focused on kids with special needs. And that's never really gone away. So when we started moving our focus from special needs kids in the late 90s to the 2000s to general, it was basically because we realized special ed teachers weren't teaching writing. They teach reading and math. They don't teach writing. We have an observational study going on in about 100 schools in Texas right now where we're looking at what happens for writing with special needs teachers and regular ed teachers. I think the end point is we're going to find not much with the, and we're selecting special ed teachers that are at least doing something. So it's already biased in a particular direction. I don't think we're going to find much. So we started realizing we need to move our focus much more broadly if this is the area of interest. Now, of course, you're not disinterested in other kids, but it expands your interest out. And so one of the things that we started doing was taking a look at what's going on in classrooms. And we've done this in the US with random samples of teachers. Norway, we're getting ready to do a study in Sweden. We've done several studies in different places in China. And we have a study that we're finishing up in Chile now. And the findings are pretty much the same. And when you look at other people's, they're pretty much the same around the world. Some teachers do a phenomenal job, okay? And this is based on survey data, so you have to be a little leery because nobody wants to present a bad picture. If I ask you if you're doing something, you don't want to tell me no, because you can figure out, you're smart, if he's asking that, he must think that's important. So you're not going to give me the lowest point on the scale. But even with that said, you see a lot of teachers who are saying that they're spending a reasonable amount of time on this, and they're doing a lot of things that, we have good reason to believe that would be effective. Even so, that's a minority of teachers. 25 to 30% would be my guess, best guess. And we've interviewed over 7,000 teachers at this point with surveys. What we basically see is kids don't write very much. 1st to 12th grade, it's better in 1st and 3rd grade. But surprisingly, in high school, the 4 top writing activities that we see in the US across multiple surveys, across multiple teacher sets, fill in the blank, writing a 1-sentence response to homework questions, making a list, and writing a summary, which is, now we're getting closer to what we typically think of writing, of something that you've read. Those are the 4 top things that happen. We don't see much frequency. Also, when we ask teachers about using practices, like the practices that I laid up there earlier, they use a variety of practices, but they don't use them very often, which is indicative, again, that there's just not much time spent on this. And I'll be really frank, I was dumbfounded on the first study we did with secondary teachers. I just assumed, secondary teachers, English teachers, they love to teach writing. I don't know what world I was living in. They love teaching literature. Yeah. So, it's an interesting thing here. I could make the case to you, writing is important in its own case. We use it to learn. We use it to persuade. We use it to entertain. We use it to think about ourselves. We use it to explore ideas. We use it to heal ourselves. I could keep going on this. But it's also important in terms of learning to read. It's one of the vehicles that you become a better reader by. And I could keep going down this thing, but we don't spend much time here. And so, you always hate ending on a negative note. But, in terms of thinking about the journey at this point, what does it mean? And I'll come back to being that elementary special ed teacher, is in terms of this journey for me, we've learned a lot, okay? I think now when we compare, just if I think about special education, we know an awful lot about how to teach kids, help them become better writers, to facilitate that process. We have a lot of tools at our disposal that we have some evidence that they make a difference. Doesn't mean that they're going to work with every single kid or in every single context or every single situation, but we're not shooting kind of in the dark, so to speak. However, when we think about that, they're not in play. And so, I have listed here some things that probably are necessary for this to be done, and I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to leave those up there. But I do want to point out one goal that I think is particularly important. So our state test, our national test, they're focused on achievement. We have an economically driven model of assessment. So we use it to evaluate, to reward and to club schools and teachers who don't do as good a job as we think they should on these tests. Now, the point I'd like to make here are really twofold. One, these tests are not that good. They probably shouldn't be used for the purposes they're being used. They're not reliable enough and not valid enough. The second thing is that their goal really basically is you're a good writer or you're not a good writer. I mean, what's our goal really here? We want kids who write across their lifetime. Now, most young people today do, but they don't consider the writing they're doing on social media as writing. But other kinds of writing they don't engage in anywhere near as much as we might like. And I think part of that is that our goal has focused strictly on becoming a better writer and not becoming a more motivated and better writer. So I wanted to point that out as kind of my end point. And I want to say thank you for coming today.